Thank you for joining our Native Voices, Native Lens panel today. I'm Tara Manthey, and I'm hosting the panel with you today. Thank you to COLab and Colorado Media Project for hosting us and this conversation and making space for this today. There she is. Hi, Dianna. Oh, we can't hear you yet, but he's working on it. And we also want to thank the Native nations whose land we're on today and we're guests of: Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Shoshone, Dianna, and hundreds of other nations with historical and current ties to this land. And recognize that we're guests today. They're upholding their end of the treaties in this area, treaties of Fort Laramie. So if you're unfamiliar with those, look them up and see what they are upholding on their end, and ask our local, state, and federal governments if they're upholding that end of the treaties is always worth investigating. So again, thank you. My name is Tara. I am a nonprofit consultant and former newspaper reporter. I live here in Denver. I'm a citizen of the Osage Nation in Oklahoma and sit on our editorial board for our independent Osage News, which was just accepted into the Trust Project. And I saw Sally Lerman on the speakers panels today, and so we're very grateful to her and that project for including us. And today we're focusing on some Native issues in Colorado and with the media. I wanted to have our guests introduce themselves. One of our guests, Jen Wolf, could not be with us today due to a family emergency. So again, we are thinking of her family and I'm holding them in our hearts. Okay, I would like our guests, we'll start with Renee, if you want to introduce yourself, your role, and why you agreed to join us today, and what brought you to us.
Thank you, Tara. Welcome, everyone. Yot'e, Shi'e, Renee Hutchens, Yinashe, Twitish Eatni Nishle, Belagana, Bashishchin, Tapa, Dashishje, Shike, Do, Shidine. Welcome. That's in Navajo. I'm Dianna, citizen of Navajo Nation. I'm actually based just outside of Denver. I'm a freelance journalist, filmmaker. My background is in public health, so I came from a communication background. Worked for CDC for about 4 years as a tribal liaison and covering really communications federally, globally, which for us really meant working from state to local issues as well. And to answer that question, as an Indigenous person, one of the number one things that we've even used this term, modern day racism, is Indigenous eraser. And so for me, that meant a lot to be part of this working group and participate in a couple of the sessions to collaborate and work together to address these issues of eraser and the narratives, which we'll talk more about. So I'll pass on the mic.
Good morning. My name is Tami Graham. I'm the executive director of KSUT Public Radio, which is located on the Southern Ute Tribal Campus in Ignacio, Colorado, in the far southwestern corner of the state. It's good to be here with all of you. KSU, the reason we're here primarily, and I think I was invited to be on this panel, KSUT was a recipient with KSJD, which is a community station in Cortez, of a 3-year Advancing Equity grant from CMP. Thank you very much. And that grant was, the name of our grant was Voices from the Edge of the Colorado Plateau. And for us, what that meant and what we're doing is we were able to hire Clark Adamitis, who's here with us today, to come out from New York and fresh out of journalism school, to be a reporter focusing on Indigenous, elevating Indigenous voices in our region, as well as Latinx, LGBTQ, and other underheard voices. So that's kind of the primary reason, but beyond that, KSUT is one of the first tribally founded community non-commercial stations in the country. In 1976 was founded as a means of communication for tribal members the Southern Ute tribe. And so 45 years later, the station still is very tied to those roots. We have a tribal radio signal, which is run by 2 Southern Ute tribal members and a member of the Dianna Nation. And we just hired a tribal media center coordinator, which is a project focused on storytelling by and multimedia training for Indigenous and Native American youth in our region, and ideally throughout the country, to offer an opportunity for storytelling, multimedia training, and elevating those voices. And so it's really great to be here. We also at KSUT have Four Corners Public Radio, it's our second signal, which is the regional NPR affiliate. So we're pretty unique in what we do and how we go about doing it, and we're really excited to be here. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Dianna, let's see if we can hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Good. Great, good. Hi, everybody. I'm Dianna Hunt. I'm senior editor at Indian Country Today, overseeing essentially projects that we do and freelance as well. So we participated, we were the editorial lead in a project with the Institute for Nonprofit News, collaboration that included 9 other partners, and produced 10 stories that stretched out over time for everybody to use. So I'm delighted to be here and happy to talk about what we've been doing.
Great, thank you. Before we dig in on the panel, I did want to lift up some of the work and findings that we lifted up through the Indigenous Voices project, which we conducted earlier in the summer, and you'll hear more about the process and work behind that at the lunch panel about the Full Voices project. We convened several community leaders in the American Indian, Alaska Native community here in the Denver area, as well as having a second group of journalists, storytellers from all over Colorado, including the southwest corner. And some of the themes that I wanted to highlight that came from that may seem pretty obvious to some and may shine some light and give you story ideas. And we're going to have the full recommendations and findings in a report later in the year, but wanted to give you a preview of that. And so this group really discussed a huge array of issues, and some of the themes that came out of that included the strengths and everyday life of Indigenous communities should be covered routinely, and not just during Native American Heritage Month, Indigenous Peoples Day, Thanksgiving, or when topics like mascots, place names, or holidays are in the public eye. And Indigenous communities care about all of the same issues other communities care about: health, education, housing, immigration, etc. And so when covering those issues, an Indigenous perspective should be included as part of that coverage. And Indigenous people in Colorado face many issues that other communities do not, due to our unique political status, history with this land, being separated from tribal communities, and more. And those are complex and nuanced and worthy of news coverage in themselves to help others understand our identities. This includes some things you've probably heard of: missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, Indian Child Welfare Act, federal relocation, access to health and education services guaranteed under treaties, language and culture, land, ecosystem stewardship, and more. And so another thing to note is there's more than 100,000 people in the Front Range alone who identify as American Indian, Alaska Native in the 2020 census. And there's many, many more across Colorado. And those people are extremely diverse, coming from hundreds of different nations, from North, Central, and South America, including all races, genders, abilities, religions, and many other identities. And so incorporating Indigenous perspectives when covering the diversity of Coloradans in those areas is important as well. And then finally, one other big theme that came up is, Indigenous issues are tied to land and the long line of past events that happened here or in other ancestral lands. And to many Indigenous people, the events of the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries our current events, because they're still impacting these communities today in unique ways. And so oftentimes talking to Indigenous folks means going way back in histories, because it is part of the current events to us. And then we did talk about interactions and coverage of news media, and really highlighted that, especially in the Front Range, there's a huge gap in coverage of Indigenous communities. There's no local media that reflects their identity, and I was reflecting on the panel this morning with the ethnic media did not include Indigenous people, because there isn't a news service for us. There is, and that is one example of many of the invisibility of Indigenous peoples, that people aren't like, oh, let's get all of the ethnic media up here, and there isn't an Indigenous perspective. It's just not thought of. And that lack of formal news leads to a lot of sharing among community members, as in many communities, but it does mean that the broader communities don't hear about those stories. And so there's a lot that we'll highlight within that in the final report. And a few last points is, organizations led by and serving Indigenous people are historically and currently under-resourced. So there's many nonprofits, community organizations working in the community, but have no media relations capacity or expertise on staff. And that contributes again to the invisibility, because they're not pushing out that information to mainstream media. Let me see if there was a few. And then there are also a robust group of Indigenous journalists and storytellers working in Colorado, many in mainstream newspapers, in tribally run media, community radio, specialty, national organizations, freelance. And there are a lot of folks who are members of the Native American Journalists Association that we were able to reach out, including Renee. And many reflected that working in mainstream media was very isolating, or often isolating. As the only Indigenous person on staff, some felt a duty to cover their communities, and that constant battle and fight to raise these issues takes a toll. And some weren't allowed to cover the community or as frequently as they would like. So again, those are some of the themes, and we'll provide recommendations, including how to better connect with local communities and build relationships. So with that, I wanted to pass this first to Renee, who participated in those Voices panels, and she will also be on the lunch panel. Kind of what, as an Indigenous woman working in storytelling and journalism, you have shared that you want news and journalism shouldn't be extractive, exploitative, or tokenizing. What some see as missteps in language, like, oops, I used the wrong words, can have huge policy and impacts on Indigenous people, and that's why words really matter. Can you share some examples to illustrate this, and also reflect on kind of what you heard in the Voices work that really speaks to you, if you have examples?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that foundational introduction. Many times I end up on these panels and I feel like I have to cover federal Indian law, colonization, and pretty much bring everyone from past all the way to the current, because it's so critical. And a lot of the conversation, I say I'm a freelance journalist, but I just say I'm a writer in general, because my passion for using my voice and being a storyteller, it's rooted in my own tradition of oral tradition as a Dianna woman, and that can look like a lot of different things in terms of storytelling. It can be art, it can be murals, it can be anything from writing to voice. Should I just keep going?
Yeah.
So I really encourage, as Tara mentioned, one of the reasons why I stepped out of mainstream media was because it was isolating, and it's hard to be the only voice when there's this tug of war back and forth to pitch stories, and it's it's hard because today, you know, as a Dianna woman, I'm speaking English to every one of you. I wish I could just speak Navajo and you all could understand, because our language is so deep. I wish I could reach in my chest and like, you know, open it up to really convey sometimes the words the English misses or lacks. We're very a verb-heavy language, which means that one word in Navajo can be multiple sentences. So for me to be a storyteller today and speak in English, challenge is an understatement, you know, because I'm doing my best to communicate very deep values and concepts. You know, Tara mentioned the land. You know, I often say I am the land in every sense of the way. So my stories, it's inseparable from the land, and so once you tap into that area, you quickly start getting into those issues. You know, I recently was speaking about land-based healing and land-based programming, land-based education, land-based pedagogy. So these ideas, it's all tied back to the land, but then you get into those topics about place names and changing place names, and why historical trauma and this land-based trauma is such a critical issue. And you know, we talked about what words and why words matter. It's the you know, for example, many times I've introduced myself to and been the only Indigenous voice in certain circumstances, and I've had people actually tell me, like, I thought you were extinct, and I just have to swallow that down and remain composed. But it's hard when it's one thing when you have misrepresentation, negative stereotypes, and another thing when people just don't even think you exist. And so that, to be a voice in that space is everything. I'm here because of my ancestors. I do my work because of my ancestors and their resistance and resilience to bring me here today. So in a sense, it's an honorable responsibility that I absolutely love. I kind of went off on another little tangent there, but words do matter, because if I could take that historical to the present, and if I had to talk about current issues in Indian country today, all of them would tie back to the dominant narratives and what has been told, because there's, you know, if we look at anthropology or the history and the education system, that dominant narrative it's stories about us. It's the colonial narrative, and so we're completely missing. And so when you have that over time, we end up in a situation today where we have Indigenous erasure. So thank you.
Thank you. One of the big findings was that invisibility, and we talked about some of the structural reasons, the lack of media covering the issues, but also the lack of mainstream journalists asking for the disaggregated data that includes American Indian Alaska Natives, asking why, when there is a panel of folks representing different ethnic groups, why there isn't an Indigenous person there. One thing that I learned about KSUT is not only that it's tribally created, but does serve the region. Does serve the region, the mainstream, the white communities, the Latinx communities, and the Native communities. So Tami, tell us a little bit about how that works. How is that structured, and how do you ensure Indigenous voices and coverage are included in the mainstream coverage?
Thank you. That's a great question. Well, one, I want to say that KSUT, our board of directors, I was saying, KSUT was founded by the Southern Ute tribe, and so in 1986, when the tribe felt that it would be KSUT would be well served as a nonprofit, to become a nonprofit organization, in the bylaws, it was written in that it would continue to be 5 of the 9 members of the board would always be Native American, 3 have to be Southern Ute tribal members, and then 2 can be from any other federally recognized tribes. So that's really important because of that, staying true to those roots, and that being a minority-led organization is really important. So having this 3-year grant that we received from CMP is really foundational for us. We haven't had a news department until just very, very recently. We're a AAA radio station. The Four Corners signal, the tribal signal, is primarily traditional powwow music, and then a diversity of other kinds of music. And so we have these distinct signals, but we also simulcast the signals simulcast for portions of the day, all things considered, morning edition, some of the other programming. And so there's this natural mix of programming on both signals. The way that it's really emerging right now in terms of that elevating and making sure that the Indigenous voices are represented on both signals is in many ways through our Tribal Media Center. We hired Colton Ashley this spring with a 3-year grant from the Colorado Health Foundation to create content that's produced by the Native American community in our region, and that is intended to serve both a Native and a non-Native audience. So I think that's important. A couple of the projects, Native Lens is a project we partner with Rocky Mountain PBS on. And we have, it's a primarily Indigenous-led project for first-person storytelling. Grab your phone in your community. What are you seeing? What issue do you want to highlight? What's going on? And then we have a Fort Lewis College graduate, Shireen Gonzalez, who's a member of the San Ildefonso Pueblo in northern New Mexico, who's our editor for that project. And we're distributing across Rocky Mountain PBS platform, KSUT Tribal Radio, and our Four Corners signal. So really trying to put, the platforms, it's not just intended for an Indigenous audience or a non-Indigenous audience. Another project is Native Braids, and a storytelling project that is Native American youth or an adult interviewing a favorite elder. And it could be like a 2-hour interview asking the kind of questions they've always wanted to ask, but maybe weren't comfortable, and then editing those and airing those on both signals. And they're beautifully produced. They're 5 to 7 minutes long when they're produced down, but then the family has that entire unedited interview for their family history to have that. So one other thing I just wanted to highlight, a project is that we're partnering, so Fort Lewis College in Durango is one of, I think, 3 institutions, maybe nationally, I know it's Stanford, and maybe Dartmouth, that offers a tuition waiver for Native American students. And so of the 4,000 plus student body population, there's over 150 tribes represented in a very small school in Durango. And so it's a tremendous opportunity, we feel, for just being geographically, 30 minutes away, being in Ignacio, to partner with Fort Lewis College and elevate those voices of the incredible diversity represented on that campus. And so one project we received funding for is what we're calling a Tribal Water Media Fellowship. And so it's a 10-day, as soon as school's out in April, it's partnering with it's called the Water Center at Fort Lewis College, but the idea is to offer a fellowship to Indigenous students or Native American students that are either science-based students or in the journalism program, come together, learn about water from water law, how Native American tribes have been impacted primarily in the Four Corners region around issues related to water, but then to find a story that you want to tell, and maybe it's from their own perspective from their tribe about water, and what does water mean, and to hear those perspectives of water from a Native American Indigenous perspective, and then so gaining those skills at the same time, whether, how to talk about water if you're a science-based student, that in a way that is true to yourself and your history, but also sharing to an audience in a way that people are pretty naive and just completely uneducated about, mostly. So we're really excited about that. And then if you're a journalism student, how to just learn more about Indian water law. And so we're really excited about that project, where it's a pilot. And so these are just the kind of projects that we're really aiming for in terms of elevating voices, Native American voices, and looking for partners, whether it's Fort Lewis College, Rocky Mountain PBS, anybody else that wants to partner, it'd be great. ICT, it'd be fabulous to partner in ways to get these stories out. So that's, again, just a little slice of what we're envisioning and creating down in Southwest Colorado.
Thank you. That is especially fascinating how you mentioned you're covering the issues that matter in the community and the Indigenous perspective on that, and not just, hey, tell us about your culture, hey, tell us about how you feel about mascots, tell us these things when it comes up. You're creating structures so that the issues that are important to Indigenous communities and other communities include those perspectives. So thank you. Okay, Dianna, sorry we lost you for a minute. You're back. Indian Country Today, also known as ICT now, really has a unique role as a national Native-led news organization that also covers local issues in depth, and that includes the similar to KSUT, these collaborative news projects with Native and non-Native organizations. Can you tell us some details about those projects that you have going, and how you make these very specific Indigenous issues relevant to a wider audience?
Yes, hi, thank you. I'm glad to be back here. Indian Country Today, as you know, is a nonprofit. We also have a broadcast division. We have a weekday broadcast that airs on more than 70% of the PBS stations in the country and as far away as Australia. So we have a very broad reach, and we don't take that lightly. One of the collaborations, we do our own stories. We work hard to bring those stories to our readers and our viewers. But we also have done a number of collaborations. The one I mentioned with the Institute for Nonprofit News that I'll share with you a little more detail. We're also in the middle of working on one right now with Reveal for a two-part series podcast on the Indian boarding school issue. We're working on something with the Center for Public Integrity. And I think collaborations offer a lot of benefits from both sides. With the Institute for Nonprofit News, as I said, Indian Country Today was the editorial lead, which meant I edited all the projects, and our writer did the overview story that tied the whole thing together. But we had 10 parts. The first was the overview story from Mark Trahant, who's our editor at large. And we wanted to evaluate the state of the economy in Indian Country. Where are the jobs? Where are the jobs of the future? What jobs are going to go away? What are new avenues for economic support that might not have been there 30 years ago? And so we drew on a number of different partners, and we each had. Sorry, I got to sign in here. We each had a territory, a story to deal with. And we were this collaboration focused on having 10 stories that would stand on their own. So each partner could take their own story, and yet they could also pick up the others because there was a thread that ran through all of them. One of the things that we did at Indian Country Today, which was surprisingly helpful, and it was sort of an afterthought when we did it, and it really worked. And that was, we did a survey of our readers at the very beginning of the project. Where do you think the jobs of the future are? What jobs do you think are going away? What are the important issues facing you? We got a really good response. We got a response from hundreds of people across 38 different states, representing more than 130 tribes. And so it was a very broad group of people, and they were all very similar in their answers. That yes, tribes need to diversify beyond casinos and gambling economies. The jobs of the future they see in healthcare and in green energy. They saw that the jobs that were likely to decline are going to be oil and gas and casinos. And so it helped us tighten the focus a little bit on what we were doing, but we had a series of stories that looked at these issues in depth. The casino story was by Wisconsin Watch, which was a partner. Wisconsin Watch has many of the mainstream media, and I worked in mainstream media for most of my 40 years in journalism. So yeah, I was at one point one of only 2 Native journalists in Texas that I was aware of. So we looked to Wisconsin Watch. They wanted to be sure that they were handling it in a way that was appropriate and yet still serious. They hired a consultant, Ann Thundercloud, to help them do outreach to the Ho-Chunk community, which they focused on the Ho-Chunk tribe. And it was very helpful. I think the tribe felt relieved to have an intermediary. I think Ann enjoyed it. I think that Wisconsin Watch benefited a good deal from that. And so that was one approach. They examined those issues. It was an interesting story. And then we had the green energy component. There were several elements that were proposed by the partners, and we went with those. We had to be really careful there wasn't overlap, but the stories were very delineated. We had a story on green energy and the growth there. It's an economic growth driver for Indian country: wind, solar, water, not dams, but other ways to deal with the water energy. And that was handled by Investigate West. We had a look at lithium, which is seen as so pervasive, so important to the green energy future, and yet taking lithium out of the ground wrecks the environment where they do it. And so that's a controversial issue. It affects a number of tribal lands. And Underscore, which is a partner, a regular partner with Indian Country Day, handled that one. And then we looked at uranium and the mess that was made with uranium mining. But the new twist here is that uranium cleanup can be a job of the future for Indian country. That there are efforts to train local people, tribal members, tribal citizens who can do the cleanup, not only in their own communities, but all over the country. It's going to be the future of environmental cleanup can generate jobs and money for Indian and Native communities. So that was handled by New Mexico in depth. And then we had some others. We looked at the oil and gas boom in the Dakotas, in North Dakota, where it's just gone crazy, but not everybody's benefiting from it. We looked at the effort by a tribe in Oklahoma to not only build up a cattle ranch, but they've also established a slaughterhouse and then a retail store where you can buy reservation-ready steaks and things like that. So it's an interesting diversification of what they'd always relied on ranching a bit. And then we looked at a story from Rawhide Press in Washington State, which found that the tribal regulations and rules make it hard for people to get jobs. If they get a job, they lose benefits, they lose childcare, they lose housing, they lose a lot of things, so that it actually costs them more to go to work at a low wage job than it does to not try to get a job, which is not right and not what you want your people to be able to do. And there was a good response there from the community. We looked at the Osage News did a story on how their tribal members are working with local government officials, and when everybody works together, the jobs are not just for one group or the other, the jobs are for a whole region. And so this was a new effort to work together. They also got a really good response. And then lastly, we had another story from our radio partner in Oklahoma, KOSU, and they looked at the Potawatomi tribes. They took on a professional basketball team, and were really generating a lot of community interest as well as jobs and entertainment and things like that. So the Potawatomi Fire, we looked at that one. And all of those came together as independent stories, but they also had that thread of economy and jobs and future running through them. And I think that we included 3 tribal media. Most of the others were partners, members of the Institute for Nonprofit News. And we looked at who benefited how. The mainstream media, the non-tribal media, was able to tap into those local community resources and have a local perspective on stories that they might not otherwise have had. The tribal media got access to some resources they might not have had otherwise. And Indian Country Today got a broad series that addressed our readers all over the country that we were able to share and to include. We reread all of them over a series of days. So we were really pleased with how it turned out. It was a lot of work, but it was beneficial, and I think those collaborations can be important. So you know, if you're in an area, reach out to a tribal newspaper. Maybe you guys work together on something. Or if you're a tribal newspaper, approach one of your locals and say, hey, we'd like to work with you on this. Are you interested? Don't give away too much because you don't want them to steal your story, but let them have the opportunity. And I think everybody learned and was pleased with the results.
Thank you very much. Again, reflecting the diversity of topics and stories that ran across this project really reflected the issues that many communities care about, and it had that additional impact on Native communities and included those perspectives. So thank you. You mentioned, Dianna, working as a Native woman in mainstream newsrooms for many years. One thing we've discovered or discussed in our Indigenous Voices groups was the hard role that is in pushing for coverage of Indigenous communities, which are everywhere. And it can be intimidating for non-Native organizations and newsrooms to cover that because of the fear of doing it wrong in particular. And so I guess from your perspective, for journalists at mainstream outlets, do you have advice, you know, if they don't have these formal partnerships yet? You mentioned like reaching out and doing those things. For those folks in newsrooms who want to cover Native communities, what is your advice?
You just need to listen to people. You need to get there. You can't pick up the phone and do an interview and have the story. You really need to be on the ground. And I know with COVID, it's changed that a little bit, but you really need to go out there and you need to listen to what they're telling you. And if you don't understand, just ask questions. Ask, say, can you explain what the tribal setup is so that I can understand it? Can you spell the name? Could you spell that, please? You know, some really basic, some really basic questions and listening, and treat them with some deference. Don't come in. My husband is also a journalist, and he covered an issue. He's not Native, and he was interviewing a protester. It was I'm not going into details on all that, but one of the large, I'm not going to name them either, large mainstream media reporter came up, interrupted, said, oh, look, I'm with the blank, 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 and can you just answer my question about that? And the Native guy looked at my husband and he looked at them, and no, he didn't answer it. He didn't have anything to do with this guy. So, you know, listen, be respectful, ask questions if you don't understand. And I would also turn you to NAJA, the Native American Journalists Association, has a guide to covering Indian country that includes some of the pitfalls. Get it, read it, look at it. If you have a question, look back. Indian Country Today has a style guide. What do we use? What do we not use? You're welcome to tap in. I think it's available on our website, which is ictnews.org. You can also get it at the old website, indiancountrytoday.com. And those are helpful. And, you know, if you have a question, you can call me or call somebody you know and say, look, is this okay? Should I say it this way? You know, how do you spell teepee? Things that are some very basic things, and don't use that word unless it's relevant. But, you know, those are the kinds of things that I would recommend. And just ask the questions, understand it from their perspective. It's basic reporting that you would do in any community. I just think that many journalists are more comfortable in the establishment communities and don't take the time and the effort to understand the perspective from other communities.
Thank you. You hit on a pet peeve of mine. The New York Times crossword puzzle spells TP wrong, and it drives me crazy.
Right. The spelling bee, excuse me.
Yeah, the spelling bee too. Thank you. Tami, same question for you. Advice for non-Native outlets or non-Native journalists in covering communities in their region.
And I'm not Indigenous, so I am. It's been a really amazing experience being at the helm of KSUT, and I've learned so much over the last 6 or 8 years. I think humility is what I've learned. Just humility and acknowledging that you don't know what you don't know, and I've been. It's been the generosity, I think, for me as a non-Indigenous person, when I kind of try to reflect that humility and asking a question that I'm trying to understand in a way that's truly trying to understand and deepen an understanding of context or whatever it might be goes a long ways, I've found. Like Dianna said, go to the community. I mean, Clark went out. Clark's only been with us for about 3 weeks, but one of the first things is he went out and covered the bear dance at White Mesa, which is not easy to find, not good directions, even if he's been there a bunch of times. And we kind of joked that was his initiation, but Clark created a beautiful, sound-rich story on the bear dance, and you could hear when he was interviewing one of the bear dance chiefs, the openness to sharing, what this really was about. And I know it's because of, who Clark is. And so just showing up in a humble way and being patient and being willing to, have some small talk first and just kind of, and don't jump in there and get right, ask the question that you're seeking, but just, be present and just hang out a little bit and take off your, whatever hat you're wearing if it isn't Indigenous, and just be willing to be present and patient. So.
Thank you.
I might throw in also, if you don't mind, that if it's a really remote area and you have trouble find someone who will take you back there, and someone who you don't necessarily need to hire a consultant, but you might hire a fixer for the day who can take you into those communities and help you meet up with the people who need to be met up with.
Yeah.
That's a groundbreaker if it's suitable, if it's would be helpful in that kind of circumstance, and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to add that Sheila Naneto, our tribal radio station manager, was planning on going with Clark for that exact reason and to introduce him to some folks, and then she had an unfortunate death in her family and couldn't go. So, but yes, absolutely.
Same question for you, Renee, please.
Yeah, I've been listening because I've definitely reiterate what both of these two have already shared, and I'm trying to add something new to the conversation. And something that comes to mind is kind of what was mentioned at the very beginning is really being intentional about covering Native people's stories and their involvement in every aspect of modern life, not just those Indigenous Peoples Day or those topics, those buzzword topics that were mentioned earlier, and then to also add, to tag on here that the cultural protocols. Sometimes there's communities that, again, that this comes back to the Native American Journalists Associations. They have a whole tab under resources and a media guide, and I know that's mentioned under there. And so sometimes when you are building relationships, those in-person relationships, it's important to remember that some of the protocols are not traditionally taught in journalism, and yet these are, I would say, the first step. And for a lot of communities, there's some of the topics related to trauma, and landing in these communities. It's a sensitive area, and so how do we show respect and be respectful? So that's another one that comes to mind. The third thing I would say is really taking a step back to think about, a lot of times in my position, I find myself identifying the gaps and whose voices are missing. Even in our own Indigenous communities, I've done some work with digital storytelling and Native youth, and this connection and this value as Indigenous people. Sometimes we've even referred to it as intergenerational knowledge transmission, and this connection between our youth and our elders, and the whole spectrum of life, and each one being valued. And so, for me, I'm always looking at that whole entire spectrum of community and who is in that community, and those who are working, whether you're in a newsroom, mainstream media, reporter, or editor, it's looking at those stories that are being pitched, and not just looking for those people with degrees behind their name, or like your first contact, or the people that are already out there that you're hearing from. It's really decentralizing this idea of like whose voices can we include in story pitches. And so that's another thing, just taking more of a grassroots approach to being intentional about those voices that you're including.
Thank you very much. One piece of advice I also give folks is who want to be more involved in Indigenous issues is, what is the issue you care about? Is it climate change? Is it children's welfare? Is it journalism? There is an Indigenous person working on that issue, and if you're covering, public infrastructure, like find the Indigenous person who cares about that. There's ways to integrate all of these things without covering the Indigenous topics. So thank you very much. Questions? Yeah, Clark.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if I could add to that
Please.
a little bit. Because I've been out reporting on the Southern Ute Tribe and the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe for KSJD and KSUT. My name is Clark Adamitis. And so yeah, that bear dance in White Mesa, Utah, it was a 2.5-hour drive into the desert. Not just for me, but also for a lot of the people that were at the bear dance. They came from all over to join there. And I wasn't sure because I wasn't going with Sheila, the tribal station manager. That was the original plan. But when I got there and the bear dance chief saw that I wasn't recording right away and that I worked for the tribal station, I was wearing my tribal station shirt and hat. And I told them, oh, I know Sheila, and they all knew her. And then we slowly started to talk. They saw that I didn't come in recording right away. I asked permission to record audio of the musician, of the singer singing the tribal songs, and then I asked the bear dance chief's permission of who I could interview, and I only scored 2 interviews that day. Usually my goal is 6 for a well-crafted radio piece, but with those 2 interviews, they really saw that I put in the effort to come out there and be respectful and to learn as much as I could. So that one went really well. And then this past weekend was the 100th annual Southern Ute Fair, which is this big 2-weekend long festival that they put on for 100 years now. And now that I've been showing my face at all these different departments and events for a few weeks now, I've been slowly starting to score more interviews as people know me and know what I'm about and know why I'm here. And then they hear my stuff on the air now. So just trying to be as respectful as possible and develop relationships.
I'm just going to add real quick.
Kudos to you.
Thanks.
And I was just going to add that too, we made sure when we aired that story, which you can listen to, they're both great, on either ksut.org or tribalradio.org, the 2 different websites. We made sure to say that we received permission from the bear dance chief, because there's a lot of tribal elders that, especially that listen to tribal radio, and we wanted to make sure that they knew that we had permission, that we weren't just kind of coming in there and, we had permission to record, but we wanted to make sure people knew that, just to make sure to kind of close that gap of respect and awareness.
And Renee or Dianna, why is asking for permission to record songs and ceremony important?
It's really important to do that. Not always. You can talk to a visitor there. One of the things that we encountered in the Reveal project that we're working on was we had a sound person along with our reporter Marionette Pember, and that person just recorded everything. Well, they also they recorded a prayer that was being offered that was very personal that we had been asked not to record, but that person didn't know it. And so we were very careful to go back to them. We went back to the people involved and said, this wasn't recorded by mistake. Do we have the ability to do that? They were okay with it. But we would not have used it otherwise, and were a little surprised that it had happened. But it was an accident. It wasn't done intentionally. So it's always good for them to know. Be really careful with the prayers and things like that. If somebody's a visitor at a powwow or something, we don't get permission from the chief. But they know we're there.
And I would say also there's a history of stealing.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, yeah, the history of in the U.S. and just in general, like, towards Indigenous people has been a cultural appropriation, stealing of, and like I said, even this idea of it's kind of a grotesque thing, but like there's even been cases where people will take our culture and resell it back. It's just sold, and there's it's like disconnecting who we are from something that's so deep and precious. It's our identity. And so to see that, it's like dehumanizing and disconnecting, and that idea of stealing and just treating it as just something that's monetary, and that's just so far from what those prayers or songs are originally intended for, or what they mean to us. So
thank you. Yeah, and it's a significant, it's hard for journalists who are used to fair use and recording in public to reconcile this sometimes, but there is those underlying issues in history. I'm going to switch microphones so I can walk the microphone around so Dianna can hear it. So I'll give you this one and I'll take some questions.
While you're doing that, I'd also like to throw out there, the lack of a news service for Indigenous people. Indian Country Today, we allow our stories to be picked up and put on other people's websites. So you're welcome to use our stuff. We just want full credit, and we don't want you going in and adding things or changing things and things like that. You can make them shorter if you need to, but talk to us about it.
I'm curious, as publishers and broadcasters, as you're creating content for an audience that is not necessarily overserved, do you find listenership and readership just automatically high, or are you also dealing with the thing that every other publisher is dealing with, just getting your content consumed?
I think for Indian Country Today, which has a 40-year history covering Indian country, I feel like the one thing that we have that so many other of the mainstream media don't have is we have widespread respect among the readers. They understand if we're involved, it will be handled appropriately to the best of our ability. And so there's that. We make a real effort not to go for clickbait. We don't just throw it out there because we think it's going to be, oh look, we'll get 1,000 clicks in an hour. We don't do that. We stick with the stories. We have a whole series, a whole project this year coming on economics, which is a really dry topic. But with the way it's being written by Mark Trahant and the way it's being presented, those stories are getting a lot of traffic. So there is a hunger out there, I think, for credible stories, for reliable stories that people can trust that deal with some of these issues. But we also do entertainment. We do sports. One of the big stories we did this year was a Native Hawaiian woman who won a surfing medal in the Olympics. We get a lot of traffic on an Indigenous sports person who won a gold medal at the World Games. Those are things that nobody knows. Sometimes Indigenous people are often hidden in those kinds of stories, and we bring those out. So I think that we have a regular readership. It's So we get spikes on stories just like everybody else does. We also get credited by the New York Times when we have a story that they decide is important for their readers too, and they don't do that very often. So we were pleased recently with that.
Thank you. Please. Hi, my name is Kat Jaffe. Thank you all so much for being on this panel today, and of course, the Colorado Media Project for the convening, and the Founder House of Pod. And some of our work has included Indigenous podcast series. So we did Guardians of the River, which won Best Podcast of the Year at Tribeca Film Festival with National Geographic, and we're currently working on one in Samoa. And our policy is that 50% of the production team will be from the community that the story is about. And one of the things that we do, and on our site we have this kind of transparency page, is we pay for the licensing fees of any of the art or music that we use within the community. And I'm curious if there's something that you've found in terms of a best practice of kind of navigating and being transparent with communities, and if you compensate them for the music that you use in your productions.
I'm sorry, did you say for the music that you use?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. We work with the people who are doing it. When we did the Reveal project, when we were on the ground recording, we told them we were there, we told them what it was, we told them we wanted to record, and they did say, avoid this, please don't record this, don't get this on video, don't get this on audio. And so we worked ahead of time, and then we were not concerned about going back to them and saying, we got this on tape, is this okay? So I would say talk with people. I think they appreciate the fact that you reach out and say, are you okay with us getting this on audio? Are you okay with this? This is very moving. Is it all right if we get this on audio? If we have it on audio, ask them about it. And so that's how I would be, that's how I would approach that.
Tami, did you
Thank
have
you for
that?
asking.
It's not exactly on point of what you're asking, but I meant to mention earlier that, so we moved into a new facility. We had a capital campaign a few years ago, and the Southern Ute Tribe was an incredible partner in that. They ponied up $1 million matching challenge match if we could raise $1 million from our community. So the broader 5-county and community that we serve, and the 4 different tribes that we serve with our terrestrial signals. And so it was this incredible partnership. But one of the things that when we were mapping out what we wanted this new building, it's a 5,000 square foot building in Ignacio on the tribal campus, was the tribal radio staff said, like Renee was saying, there's been real major issues with Native American music being, co-opted, commodified, appropriated, ending up in Europe and who knows where. And so we created a performance studio where not only could we do live performances of visiting and touring musicians, but Indigenous drumming groups and singing groups could come in and get a really good high quality recording of their music and own it outright and make it very, very, very attainable, affordable, to do. And so that to address that issue of appropriating of Native American music, to the degree that we could help. And I guess I would just echo what Dianna said, which, you already know. It's just that getting permission and making sure that, double, triple, making sure that folks are comfortable, not only when you're recording music, but then, when it comes to actually, if you're using it in a story to like we did, just go out. We go out of our way to make sure that anybody listening knows that we have permission, because we are, even though we're tribally founded, our Four Corners Public Radio signal is a largely non-native audience that listens to that signal, and so we just want to make sure that we go out of our way to make sure everyone knows that we're being respectful and in every way that we can with our content.
Thank you, Renee.
I'm going to add on to that. Best practices, yes, compensate. Because, and I'm also merging this into the just film industry as well, coming from that background, and then talking about cultural protocols. And, I was recording sound and video for film last summer, and we had a singer where, afterwards, because were working with the community already, sometimes it didn't look like monetary compensation, or it would be in a roundabout way, like it would be tobacco, or for example, there was a community feeding, and food is a central part of our traditional societies and our value as relating to kinship with the land and our language. And so, rather than say give money, we were given money, but it was turned into purchasing food and for my tribe, butchering a sheep, is something that's very honorable and dear, and it's a way to show gratitude. And so just consider that there's other ways than monetary, and as far as like seeing what compensation really is.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, let me run over here. I'll go this one and then that one.
Hi, I'm Susanna Spear. I write Immunocompromised Times, which is a Substack for the immunocompromised community. So it's a really niche community, and it's only about 3% of the population. A lot of the material, though, is relevant to more than 3%. It's sort of how do you stay safe, how do you negotiate boundaries when dealing with this sort of COVID world and COVID risk. So I would love to be able to write a story about how people in Native American communities are negotiating boundaries regarding their immunocompromised family members or immunocompromised individuals. And I was just wondering if you had any resources to go through, because it only being 3% of the population, it is kind of a needle in a haystack to some degree.
Thank you. I think American Indian Alaska Natives are probably misrepresented in that group, a high proportion, because of the history of lack of access to health care, intergenerational trauma. Renee, Dianna, Tami, do you have recommendations?
I mean, there's always the Indian Health Service, and you might want to look at communities that have been hard hit by COVID, and there are a number of tribal communities that have been hit heavily by COVID, and go to those communities to say, you've seen the devastation, where are the people who are particularly at risk, and what's being done to help them, and what are they doing to protect themselves. But that might be a place to start, and then you go to that community, go to that clinic, go to the nearby service center and say, what are you doing to protect people who are particularly at risk?
Hi, I'm Tim Russo. I'm from KGNU Community Radio, and first I wanted to just say thank you for the knowledge sharing today. Appreciate that. The question I had, and you had mentioned briefly about the intergenerational exchange and sort of youth-elder dialogue, and if we could talk a little bit more about how, from your media outlets and the experience across some of the Native media outlets right now, we are incorporating the youth into the tools and passing the baton, because at KGNU as well, we have Indian Voices that's run by Teresa Halsey, deeply involved with the community and running for close to 40 years or longer. But there's a challenge with the passing of the baton and inspiring the youth generation to be deeply involved in that process. Perhaps it's just the media, the radio, for example, but I'd like to hear how we're trying to get beyond that challenge. And Clark, you may have some insight into this as well, is there's a lot of unlearning of the colonial approach to media that needs to happen when bringing folks in from J schools and more formal training, that side. So I'm interested to learn how folks are tackling this challenge, or if it even is a challenge in outlets that you work with.
Thank you.
Go ahead, if you want.
I mean, I'm happy to address this.
Okay, go ahead, please.
I'm sorry. One of the things that Indian Country Today or as you know, is now ICT. The younger generation really was more comfortable not using the term Indian country. I think that people still identify us as Indian country, so I use them both interchangeably. But that was a step. We also have, in addition to people like me with the gray hair, we also have a number of younger journalists who bring a different perspective to the newsroom, who bring a different perspective to issues, and we listen to what they have to say. We turn them loose on stories from their perspective. And so diversity within your own newsroom can help accommodate that. We have story coming up on a TikTok element that I probably wouldn't have thought of, but they did. And so looking and listening, not just to the elders, but to the youth as well, can bring lots of different voices to your reporting.
It's a great question. Part of it is, I think, meeting youth where they are. Like one of the projects that I didn't mention with the Tribal Media Center is a partnership with the Dream Warriors, which is an indigenous collective of spoken word poets and hip hop artists. And Tanea Wonder is kind of the manages the Dream Warriors. And so we brought the Dream Warriors in to Toyac, which is the home of the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, as well as Ignacio. A few times over the last couple of years to do a multimedia training with youth, and with the goal of working with the youth to create a video that they write the music, they write the if they're into poetry, if they're into like filming, that whatever, just in a short 4 days. And it was really beautiful to watch those kind of sparks, like when you're young and you don't know you have an interest in something until you know, and because of something maybe like that. And so kind of offering, here's a suite of opportunities and what's of interest to you, and kind of just providing opportunities for engagement so that the youth can realize, like, wow, that was cool, but not like saying, well, this is how we do it, just offering as wide a spectrum as possible. And we're just starting to really be able to do that with our Tribal Media Center, because it's pretty young, only a couple of years old at this point. But Fort Lewis College, again, is, I think, a great opportunity in partnering with students up there. And like, what platforms of interest to you? How do you want to tell your story? Great, go for it. Let's give you a little bit of training if you need it, and then you teach us, how to tell, the best way to what you need to tell that story. So
I'll just quickly add that working with youth, it's I always remind them that everyone's a storyteller. You just don't know it if you haven't tapped into it. And it is really just meeting them where they're at. There's sometimes, if the goal later is to write a story, we'll keep that a little bit further down on the timeline. But I know in one case I was in the White Mountain Apache area and working with youth, and we were talking about suicide and mental health issues, so some tough areas that have impacted some of their communities there. And rather than just being like, well, tell me how suicide has affected your community, it was like, one of them was really interested in sports, and another one was really into art, and another one was getting into learning their traditional dance. And so we just went and spent time with them. Kids love to, now there's more options than during that time in 2012, where now we have really high-tech smartphones and ways to do photography, but kids are always involved, interested in sharing their world around them, and it's just kind of being the supporter and really letting them take the lead. And I think building that relationship really opens them up later on down the road to really jump into that story.
Thank you.
Is that one thing?
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, in J school, they basically taught us to not interview people below the age of 18 because you have to get parents' permission, and it just adds a whole step. But already, basically right away, since reporting here, I've interviewed people under 18. I've gotten their parents' permission, but it's really important because they're part of their community, they are passionate about their community, and the main one I interviewed was the newly crowned Miss Southern Ute, which is a high school senior who gets crowned Miss Southern Ute every year. And she's an important part of her community right now, and it just happens, she's been going out to all the events, the bear dance, the Ute Fair, and yeah, it's been important to really, really highlight her and prioritize her.
Okay. Thank you. I think are we wrapping up on time? Any last questions? Okay, well, thank you to our panelists. I appreciate you, and thank you to our audience. And we'll be up here if you have any questions in the meantime. Thank you. Thank you, Dianna.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
guys so